Thank you for joining us today. My name is Miriam Keller. I'm City Planning Executive for General Planning and Design at the city's Planning and Urban Design Agency. I'm getting the Speak Up sign, which is a common sign I receive, so thank you. And standing with me here is Mary Hart Burton, the city's zoning administrator. And really, we're thrilled to welcome everybody here. We have been anticipating this kickoff for a long time. I know some in the audience feel the same, and for others who are new to this conversation, just really welcome. So we are here to officially launch the zoning upgrade, a modern code to meet the moment, which is the city's first major zoning rewrite and map update in more than 50 years. Actually, more than 50 years, actually, since the 1950s. So this really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to modernize the rules that shape how land is used in the city and to ensure that those rules reflect the community's priorities and values and needs and tomorrow's aspirations for our community. So this zoning upgrade, or ZOOP, as we lovingly are calling it, builds on the foundation of the Strategic Land Use Plan, which the Planning Commission adopted earlier this year after a lot of community engagement. It was a fun and analytical process that involved a lot of hard work for many people in this room. So for those who are sticking with us, great to see you. So between the Strategic Land Use Plan and now the zoning upgrade, these efforts will create a zoning code that is more clear, more consistent, more responsive to the priorities of St. Louis and its residents and businesses. And we know very well that our current system is far from perfect, and we're really looking forward to diving into this work and digging in deep to build a new zoning code that is user-friendly and ready to meet the demands of our city today and in the future. And we're really excited to do that work, digging into this with all of you. So to help guide this process, the city has partnered with Code Studio, which is a nationally recognized planning firm specializing in zoning, and they're leading a great team of people with a lot of expertise and knowledge of best practices in this work from around the country.
So today's panel is going to bring together some planning and zoning experts with a wealth of knowledge to help us understand what zoning is, how zoning can help us, why it matters, and what tools it can use to bring St. Louis into the next century. We're going to start with some context and insights from our panelists, and then we're going to open the floor to each of you for questions and feedback because you're a critical part of shaping the path forward for the city. If you have a question, please write it on the note cards that are provided, and one of the team members will be around to collect them. And with that, let's get started by introducing our panelists.
All right, we got the slides back in order. So with us tonight, very generously, is Dara Eskridge, the CEO of Invest STL. And Invest STL facilitates investment in St. Louis's legacy Black neighborhoods so that residents can power self-directed futures for their communities. Dara, an urban planner, architect, and philanthropic leader, advances opportunities to build wealth and power in Black and other racially and economically marginalized neighborhoods through equitable development and investment practices. Home for Dara is in St. Louis's multifaceted North Side with her 2 kids and their ever-emerging garden, which I think is a perfect way to describe a garden, ever-emerging.
We have panelist Lee Einsweiler. Lee's been involved in planning and zoning and plan implementation in a variety of settings over the last 35 years. He sharpened his skills preparing zoning and subdivision regulations across the country, so we're looking forward to hearing from him.
We're bringing the firepower, as you can see. Mitchell Silver. Mitchell is an award-winning planner with over 40 years of experience. He is truly internationally recognized for his leadership and contributions to contemporary planning issues. Mitchell served as, this is going to be a lot you're going to see, as commissioner of the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, a principal at McAdams, chief planning officer in Raleigh, North Carolina, president of the American Planning Association, the American Institute of Certified Planners, and president and co-chair of the City Parks Alliance.
Next panelist is Noor Winter. Noor is an urban design and historic preservation consultant with more than 40 years of experience nationwide. He focuses on design strategies that promote the distinctive characteristics of individual communities and neighborhoods while enhancing economic vitality, sustainability, and heritage conservation. He's developed design guidelines for more than 100 historic districts and downtowns with special review areas.
It's a lot of historic districts. And then last but not least, Peter Park is a city planner and educator that has led innovation in land use and transportation planning practice for over 25 years in both the public sector and private sector. He served as planning director of Milwaukee and Denver and oversaw comprehensive code and zoning map replacements in both cities that deliver innovation with practical results and streamlined development permitting. Sounds like pretty relevant experience for this conversation. As a former planning director, Peter really does have unique perspectives. I've learned a lot from him already today on urban development and regeneration and special expertise in the areas of collaborative community planning, regulatory reform, trans-oriented development, as well as organizational management. And so with that, I will turn it to Dara. And thank you all again.
All right. Oh, that's loud. Okay. So first, let's do another round of applause for you all to come out and talk about zoning on a Wednesday. It can be highly technical and sometimes really boring fare, but it really is one of the things that shapes our day-to-day quality of life. So I'm excited that we can dig into it with such experts here, even if they are all dressed in blue. So, to open us up, no, I'm an architect, so. Mitch, let's start with you. Tell us from your perspective, what's the legacy of zoning in America, and particularly, who has it served, who's benefited, and who has it marginalized?
Well, before we begin, do a lot of these sessions, and I have to commend St. Louis. Not only are you here to talk about zoning, but what a diverse group in terms of age, ethnicity. It's refreshing to see. Candace was one of the interpreters. I was just saying, this is different. And so I commend you for all different aspects of this community coming out to hear zoning. So I'm not going to go deep into the history. After looking, if you didn't pick one up, please do. It goes over the overview of the history of zoning in the United States. And the US is unique. We're one of the only major country that has this tool called zoning. Most other places use policies and consents, but we actually use zoning. It's based in basically our Constitution, where people have a right to use their property, and so it went through our system and we came up with zoning. To give you an understanding of how it came about, we were basically an agricultural, rural country economy until the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s. From 1800 to 1900, our population in the US grew was 5 million in 1800. By the 1900, it swelled to 76 million people during that period. Most people, that growth came from immigration. People were coming to cities. We moved to an industrial economy. And as a result, there was a lot of housing around industry, and the way we were building our cities were killing people. Whether it was having horse-drawn carriages, fire, lack of light, poor health, and so there was a lot of frustration about what was being built next door to someone's property. Back then, people just sued each other. And there was basically, before zoning, there were restrictive covenants, for the most part, prevented Jews and blacks from living anywhere in close proximity where people lived. The business community got so frustrated with this process that they reached out to then Herbert Hoover. I think he was Commerce Secretary. They put a group together and decided we had to do something, and they explored, and it was some pieces of it in Europe. called zoning. And in 1921, Congress passed the zoning enabling legislation. And by the 1950s, almost every state adopted this enabling legislation. For the most part, it was to organize and separate land uses to make sure there were orderly growths. But unfortunately, over time, people started using it to protect their interests and to protect their property values. And that has not changed today. There were large lots to ensure that there were large homes. If people wanted to have other type of housing or opportunities, the zoning did not allow it. It was based on single-family zoning, which prevailed across the country. Although it intersected with redlining, that became a feature which restricted where people can live. But if you take it to modern day, it has advantaged those that have the power, influence, and insiders who know the current zoning and system and access to those in power that basically get special treatment when it comes to zoning. And those that do not have that access are marginalized. That has been the case today. For example, if a city wants to put in density, oh no, traffic, or affordable housing, oh no, crime. And you start hearing little by little, or a mixed-use project, oh no, we don't want that, it's light, air. And so what has happened is that those that had access to zoning has used it not to encourage good things from happening, but to prevent things from happening and protect their property values. So it has become exclusive over time. It is used to protect certain communities. And more, the older codes have now been updated to ensure that it's more equitable across the board. The process is simpler, but to me that has been a big concern. And then there's this other term you will all hear when it comes to zoning cases, is that we're here to protect community or neighborhood character. To this day, I have no idea what that means. And we're trying to fight this invisible community character. It's different, it's this emotion, this feeling, but as a result, there are those that have not. And zoning over time, although it's a tool to provide orderly growth, has really been used as a weapon to prevent and protect those that have property interest. So that is kind of the overview history. I encourage you to read this publication. It goes far deeper than I'm going, but it is a necessary tool to organize and encourage growth in your city, to make sure there's a balance of all the land uses that you need to be a functioning city. And I'm very excited that you're now taking this on to modernize your 70-year-old zoning code. Welcome to the 21st century.
Anybody else want to jump in on the legacy there?
So what I often say about zoning, while there's a lot of technical aspects to it, updating a zoning code, the technical part is actually fairly straightforward. It's political. And so it's really important, right? It's not the nature of zoning to have had these deleterious effects on cities. Zoning is a product of humans and social and society and these interactions and how we create the laws, right, that apply to property. So it can be done well, it can be done in an exclusionary way. It can create great outcomes, it can create terrible outcomes, right? And I think one of the things that is maybe one of the most significant sort of substantive legacies from the built form of cities is zoning was about the separation between where people lived and the most, right, impactful industry. So separation. So this separation of use, as well as the separation of buildings, gets carried out in ways that has de-urbanized places. If you think about it, the greatest cities in the world, in America, were built before the first zoning code in America, and after the first zoning codes in many parts of the country. That tradition of building urban places based on transit and walkability continued. It was really this era in the 50s zoning codes that all of us have worked on and updated, right? which is basically undoing the fundamental driving philosophy in post-World War II America, that privileged the separation of uses, that privileged low densities, and most significantly privileged the automobile and cars over people and walking. It's kind of that simple, quite frankly. And
If I can just interject real quick, what was the driver of that?
I think Mitch covered that, right? And in terms of those drivers, those intentions of marrying this notion of the American dream and painting the city and urban places and urban dwellers as this is what we need to move away from. This is what we need to get away from. Now, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of things that conspired here. The auto industry, or like a whole number of things based on this idea of freedom, this idea of, right, separation. But zoning was used as a tool, really, to separate these things. I mean, if you think about it, you have corridors of great main streets that were along streetcars, right, and buildings and storefronts, and they became non-conforming, right? Because now you have a minimum setback and you have a parking requirement. When we updated the zoning code in Milwaukee and in Denver, we basically legalized tens of thousands of properties by writing a code that matched the pattern that existed in the 1920s, right? So I think this is a really significant thing that is pervasive in a lot of our work, is just reintroducing urban ideas that really are part of the fabric and the DNA of this city. We spent the day touring many neighborhoods, and just beautiful, beautiful neighborhoods, and the craftsmanship of building. I live in Denver. I wish we had buildings like St. Louis has. We're a much newer city. We don't have this legacy of great buildings as you do. But in those buildings, for us, there's a lot of fantastic DNA to rewrite your code from.
I wanted to add a little bit to that from my perspective of being especially interested in neighborhood character, and Mitchell raised that as a term that shows up in development review or permitting quite often, and it's fuzzy and hard to define. But are there ways in a code to begin to describe more specifically what some of those key character-defining characteristics are, so that we know in advance what we mean by neighborhood character in place A and place B? And can a code begin to capture some of that and be responsive to it? And I think the point that a lot of that was achieved before zoning is important to know. There were ways of traditional building that people built in. It doesn't mean we build that way today, but we can learn from that and figure out ways to translate that for the way new development may occur in a way that's going to be compatible and support neighborhood character.
Thank you for raising that, Nuray. So this very nebulous term around neighborhood character, right? It can be a framing for doing something good and beneficial for all, but historically in zoning, as Mitch and Peter have pulled out, it also was a way to exclude people, right? How we cut people out from opportunity. St. Louis experienced unimaginable devastation back in May. I mean, I could not fathom something like that in my lifetime. But I think that if we're taking a critical eye, we can see that the tornado was not the original culprit, right? It was really the sum of unjust choices, several of them being zoning in nature, that has really delivered the conditions that we see today. And so how do we think about, this nebulous neighborhood character and updating a zoning code? How do we think about that to address the consequences of zoning, especially when it has separated people by economics and race has cut people out from services and opportunity, and really has left some neighborhoods more vulnerable to climate and changing climate conditions.
Can't take that. Wow. So I guess the one thing that I will say is that I had the opportunity to work with all these gentlemen before, which is part of the reason we're all sitting up here. And we have all tried very hard in a variety of settings to bring forward the best of these toolkits and to strive to eliminate the worst things that have been put in the toolkit and simply need to go away, the worst practices, et cetera. And I happen to know that based on the age of your code, this city has built a series of processes that allow people to sort of set their own set of rules for a given property, right? And those processes right now are done through the variance process and other kinds of processes that are kind of going around the zoning. Variance is supposed to be relief because of a problematic thing on your site. Like, there's a big rock in my side yard, so I need to move the building over, so I need a variance on this side, right? It's supposed to be stuff like that. It's not supposed to be, well, I have an extra wide Hummer, and so my garage needs to be 2 feet more over here into the side yard, and I'm just gonna ask for that because I think I have the right to do that. It's my property. Well, you're actually encroaching on your neighbor when you do that. You're not necessarily crossing the property line, but you're putting your building closer to them. And when those are made, decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, it is extremely hard to build a solid system that is always equitable. The simplest, most equitable system is to get the rules right in the first place, set them once, and make at least the great majority of people live by the same rules. That means sometimes loosening up on certain kinds of rules that otherwise we might feel were necessary. But also it means sometimes being a little harder about those rules. But as a developer, your biggest enemy is the amount of time it takes to get your approval in place to build something. Because you've already started giving people money to do something for them on their property, and the longer it takes, the less money you're gonna make. So every time you have process, it's a challenge. Now, there are good reasons to have process. Nori can tell you about a few of those. But the fact of the matter is our firm worked for both Raleigh and Denver. The Denver code is a little bit older than the Raleigh code. Both of them are still in place, and both of them are dominated by what is called by right zoning. And that means that the rules are out there for everybody to read and understand. The staff actually understands the rules. There's pictures in the book that show how to measure the rules. There's all the kinds of things that everybody needs to feel like the system is fair and equitable, and to allow people to build at with a discussion with the staff and approval at the staff level. The minute you need a system that goes beyond that, you better have something extra special. Now, as you've heard from people who've cruised around town, you got a lot of extra special in this city. But the question is it extra special because of the way the buildings are sitting on the site? Is it about the height of the buildings or the fact they have pitched roofs? Certain kinds of things we can make sure we get in a by right process. Now, what we can't get is for somebody to say whether your paint color is exactly right.
So I'm going to jump in here real quick,
yeah.
because I saw Mitch kind of shaking his head vigorously. Mitch, I'd love to hear from you, but also, where have you seen places that have gotten a good solid set of zoning rules to help even the playing field?
First, let me say, I'm not saying this because Coach Judy was here, but we went through a very painful exercise of having difficult conversations with our public about moving to by right. In other words, most of our projects are administratively approved. The public has their say in crafting the zoning rules, and then after that, it's all administratively approved. You don't like the rules, make a text change.
What we did not want to have is these one-off conversations every meeting, appeal, variance, is unpredictable to the development community. Hell, like, I'm out. I'm going to some other jurisdiction. This is crazy. I need predictable set of rules. The point I was going to make, and that's one, was that every code starts with these three words, which is the purpose of zoning: to protect public health, safety, and welfare. It is silent on design. It is silent on neighborhood character. It is silent most of the value-added issues that most people care about. That tends to dominate the zoning conversations. And if you want to know what changed from before to now, is that back then when I described to you what it was like to live in 19th century New York City, it was deadly. They wanted to protect public health, safety, and welfare. We have new threats today. We have the effects and past harm of redlining. We have a lack of affordable housing. We have a changing climate. We have a scarcity of land, or we have vacant land. Public health, safety, and welfare has changed. And if you have a 1950s code, it is not built to deal with the current issues today. And so you're having these sidebar conversations to fix it. So to me, that is a bit of a problem. And so my hope going forward, you have these tough conversations. I remember there was one client, I'm sorry to say this, I'll tell you the state, not the city, in Evanston, Illinois, and I had to, after doing a diagnostic, I said it, oops. Look, I told the mayor, I said, do you have a code or is this a citywide HOA? And the mayor said, how long have you been here? I said, about a week. He said, you got it right. They had 30 boards and commissions. Yes, the plan commission, no. We the citizens will make the decision. They litigated every single issue and they're wondering why they weren't getting development. So they're trying to update their code because they recognize the mayor, this is a problem. Businesses don't want to go there. I'm out. There's too many rules, it's unpredictable. Here are the rules, but now I go to this group and they go, oh no, we have neighborhood character considerations. What is that? We'll let you know. That's not it, try again. So to me, I think, particularly for larger affordable type housing projects, was very difficult, all the scary things they would hear, because as we all know, some people feel renters are subhuman, even though they pay taxes too. Renters pay taxes, by the way, through their rents. So they're all contributing to overall, that those are some of the tensions to me is public health, safety and welfare, and I feel Peter wants to weigh in as well, so then pass.
I do. And then Peter, you're living in Denver, right? I do. And we've heard some praise for by right zoning, but in a town that has a growing disparity gap, what are the limitations of by right?
I think the by right question is a function of your plan. One of the things to remember is zoning is simply a tool. I think we're going to talk about this later, but it's one of the tools to implement the vision of your city. And the great thing is you've just adopted an exciting, a great new plan. You've discussed with the community what your shared aspirations for your future is. You have a 50s code to implement it. Nope, not going to happen, right? That's why you need a new code. But with regard to environment, with regard to equity, with regard to economic development, with regard to urban form, with regard to connecting and integrating land use and transportation, you've addressed all of those things and more in the plan. The plan that you've adopted is the guide for the work that we will do. And the thing about this by right question is because in Milwaukee, when we redid the zoning code, the primary driver was because everything required a variance. And in Denver, didn't require variances, but everything required a rezoning. So Denver probably has one of the highest numbers of PUDs, planning unit development zonings, and a whole range of custom tools. And in all of these cases, and St. Louis has this, it is a symptom of a problem. It is the device to work around an inadequate code, right? But here's the problem from the community perspective, at least in my experience. What happens is, to get a project done, and you're a small business, or you're a big developer, you have to hire the right legal, you might have to hire lobbyists, you might have to, not everybody has the budget to do that. That is fundamentally a barrier for just folks who just want to open their business and have got to go through this whole process, right? And the thing about it is, you've done this, you have variances, you have records of here's what it took to get to yes. Codify that. That's what we do, is we look at, you've had all these conversations, do you really have to have them over and over and over again, or can you just codify it so that there's fundamental fairness for property owners to know what can happen across the street from them and next door to them, and what they can do with their property, right? And the plan is the foundation for you to be able to do that.
I want to add another aspect to that, and it's not the developer, well, not the private sector developer, but as part of the Denver process, sorry, I was working a lot in the neighborhood aspects and had meetings with a variety, with a round table of affordable housing developers. And what they said is, we can't risk buying a piece of property and then finding out if we can build our project. It has to be shovel ready, which means the code has to already tell us we can do this project before we start. So it has a direct impact on affordable housing and inclusiveness that sometimes is overlooked because we focus maybe on just the private sector developer. But there is another side of the development community that also needs predictability.
I'm hearing a lot of tension here between, we have a code that requires a variance for everything under the sun. So on paper, it's highly restrictive. In practice, it's highly flexible. So we've got that side of it, but then hearing you all say, but we also need a code that's like, once you get it on paper, codify it, and you just go forward. So where's the balance? How do we update a zoning code? What are some specific things that we can do that really create an enabling, flexible environment that allows for innovation in housing and transportation and commercial development?
So the number one thing that we found ourselves doing an awful lot of lately is mapping. Because what we need to know to write the rules for a given neighborhood is, what are the setbacks today? How far back is the house from the street? Is there a side driveway that goes past every house? Which means we have to do something different about the side setback to make sure that's possible in the future. Is there a detached garage with every house? I don't think we want a result that yields, for example, a house form of development disappearing and 6 townhouses with garages that face the street and back out into the street, right? That's not an appropriate form of development. So we find ourselves measuring, photographing, looking at all the various patterns. And probably based on era of development, based on the zoning that underlay it at that point in time that set the lot size when they were platted, there's probably some characteristics here that are quite uniform that should be codified. And your existing districts, we wouldn't be having variances if those rules that built the building that's on the site today were allowed to be used on into the future. So that's a lot of what happens, is just correcting the rule set to match the pattern on the ground, but also to allow for some flexibility for more activity in that area. Also then, we've been talking about physical form There's also the question of use. What can I use it for? Can I put 2 families in something that looks like a house? Well, it seems like maybe that'd be okay. Can I put a 3rd family above the garage in the backyard? Maybe that's okay too. So those will be conversations that we'll be holding that may not change the urban form of what's there, but may actually change the whole attainability, affordability equation as we move forward.
Mitch?
Well, first, let me say that from my perspective as a planning director, when an applicant, not saying a developer, because there's all sorts of applicants come through the door and they ask me, what can I do on this piece of property? I want to be able to give them an answer, whether it's a rezoning or it's a site plan. It is frustrating to me, before our code was updated, because I knew there was a lot of public involvement, they would come in saying, I don't know. I know what our rules say, but once you go out there, it's a free-for-all. And I don't want to do business here. I need predictable rules. I may not like all the rules, but I'm looking for fairness and consistency with the rules. If there are all these variances and flexibility, I prefer predictability, but development community or applicants also like some flexibility, but they should be limited and at least discussed. Outside of that, it's just not permitted. That to me was basically frustration number 1. Now, I'm very pleased to hear you did your plan, your strategic land use plan. That basically is your blueprint. And then the zoning should now fulfill that blueprint. And I'm sure you have low density, medium density, high density, mixed use, neighborhood mixed use, commercial mixed use, office, downtown, all those flavors. But when you do the land use map and go to zoning, my question is, if you truly want aspirationally to see that future land use map built, how easy are you going to make it happen? Because when I was in Raleigh, we want mixed use development. No, you don't. And the council said, what are you talking about? Because you're making it too hard. It's easier for me to buy a greenfield property out in the county and develop it than to do what you want me to do right here in St. Louis. It's just too hard. It's brain damage. Why should I do it? And so if you want something done, make it easier to do. Make your rules easier to do. Set all the rules in place so you know what the predictability is for the council, for the public, for the planning commission, for the developer. But far too often, we want these fudgy rules where we can live between the margins. And I think that's where people get frustrated. So to me, it's predictability with some flexibility, but make it easy to do the right rules in the right places. My friends from Co-Studio, that's one of their mantras. But if you want to see mixed use and more density and affordable housing and all these other things that you aspire to have, then make your rules easy to get it done.
Your question was about, how to provide some flexibility. And one of the things that the codes that Code Studio have developed are ones that
Have what I would call menus of design options for a particular situation.
what do I mean by that? This is getting kind of detailed, but one of the popular things in a code like we anticipate here is to encourage in a corridor or something rather, a storefront on the street level because it's an active use, it's visually interesting, it's scaled to pedestrians, it makes the walking experience along the sidewalk inviting.
Go from building to building. Well, it may be, though, that in every case, the market or whatever doesn't support a storefront in every one of those buildings. Well, what's the objective? Well, it's partially active use, but it's also something visually interesting in its scale. Are there other options in a menu that could be provided? Wall art, landscape itch, maybe other ways of having displays of what's going on inside the building, which are not literally seen through the storefront. Now, that's maybe micro detail, but it's an example of how you can provide some flexibility and still have the predictability of we want a street level that's active and interesting.
Yeah, we describe that as flexibility within a defined range, right? So it is as objective of a standard as possible. right? And the other thing too in these conversations is, zoning codes have really moved away from lines and lines of text, right, and legalese to becoming more graphic. And Code Studio is a great team for doing this. Because a picture can tell 1,000 words. And the reality is, what we often encounter is, there's a multi-unit development coming in, and people are losing their mind because it's not a single family. But when you look at the actual design, it looks like a house. It's 4 units, but it's a house scale. And around St. Louis, you've got a lot of these. You've got unbelievably beautiful stock that are exemplary for the rest of the country. I wish I could spend more time here. I would just take more and more pictures and show other places. This is how you do. You create diversity and housing diversity at a block scale. So while you walk around the neighborhood, someone might say, oh, it's primarily a single unit neighborhood. If you look closely, no, there's a single unit, and there's a duplex, and there's a triplex, there's a coach house behind there. There's actually quite a range of densities. The other piece to this, I think, is a challenge, and we tried to confront it in Denver in 2008, and we couldn't at that time, but we're tackling it now, is the size of a unit. And most cities allow an unbelievably huge building. Even in the lowest density single unit zones, the volume of building is actually quite large. And so if you're trying to the way I describe it is we should write the codes in communities that care about affordability and creating more housing diversity and more choice. We should focus on how do you get more small to privilege getting more small, more affordable, more attainable housing rather than few big. And so part of that is controlling the size of a single unit, and you might be able to get a little bit more floor area if you do a duplex, if you do a triplex. So the building might grow a little bit bigger, because what happens in many markets, and this happened in Denver, is we weren't able to scale down if you're gonna do a 1-for-1 replacement or replace a single with a single. And so beautiful 19-teens bungalows, because the economics, people were buying that beautiful bungalow for the dirt, tearing them down and building a big house. And that happens over and over again.
That's not neighborhood character.
Well, it's also not density, right? People, a developer bought a duplex, beautiful 1-story duplex. Each unit's 900 square feet, maybe. Tore it down and built a big 3-story house. And people are telling me, Peter, our neighborhood's densifying. I said, no, actually, we lost a unit, right? But you're right, we got a big house. We got a big building. And the thing about it is that's what so much of what people perceive in terms of the change that they react to is not only the loss of the character of the buildings that they know, but it's also the shift in the scale. And just, so in this journey you're gonna have, this is a team that's gonna really be able to host these conversations through really, really clear, strong graphics. And you can have these conversations about how do you calibrate, how much do you want to calibrate relative to, closer in neighborhoods, which have a different pattern and scale than further out neighborhoods do.
I'm just going to flag, and certainly emphasizing the amount of experience that you all collectively hold in this field, and also argue that in the long arc of human processes and organizations, zoning is really in its teenage years. So I think in some ways, what we're hearing is some very strong, well-informed hunches about what could work, but I think there's still a lot to discover. And Peter, pulling on a thread that you said earlier, at the heart of it, zoning is really a political right? A political interaction. And so when we think about flexibility within a range, that within a range piece gives me a lot of tension because that's where the politics come into play. So as we look forward and we're looking at, okay, we have a new land use plan, we have several neighborhood plans that have been adopted, some that are underway right now. What role does zoning have in the implementation of those plans? And when we think about the push and pull, what are some really strong considerations that we need to keep top of mind? And please share in specifics and root them in experiences that you all have had in other cities.
So I'll explain our process. We came first with our comprehensive plan, and we identified hot topics that were not, because a comprehensive plan is a policy document. It's a policy guide. And we know that there are three ways you implement that plan, that blueprint for growth. It is through your comprehensive plan, policies and actions, through actual capital investment, and the third is your zoning. Now, codify the rules you want to fulfill that vision for the city. We came up with a list of hot topics. So when Code Studio came on board, we gave them the list of those hot topics. Transitions between density and neighborhoods, transition between higher density and lower density, backyard cottages, cottage courts, smaller homes. We had a list of all the stuff people were worried about. Neighbor character was one that we left off the table because we just could not define it. And so from that, we had a conversation and let all the politics ugly fight it out at the code writing process. But once, and that's what we said, guess what? Our process to get something reviewed, I think there were 26 steps. We narrowed it down to, I think, 5. And so we had those battles up front, all the public engagement, but once the code was done, these are the rules. We can revisit it if we want to. We made a lot of amendments, and we were told, same as Denver, the first couple of years will be a lot of text changes to make sure you tweak it to get it right, but those are the rules. The public engagement is now out of the picture. It happened at the code drafting, code writing stage to get the rules right.
Here are the hot topics. This is what we want to see.
Nori, we brought him in.
I cannot tell you how that transition part of our code was a license. It addressed so many different solutions.
But that's where the politics come in. That's where you start hitting the ground. We made sure all people were there, from the real estate to community to business, across the board. But to me, that's what made our code successful. And yes, we did tweaks over the years. And as a result, if you come to Raleigh, North Carolina and see what it looked like before the code and after the code, you would say, I'm leaving St. Louis and I'm moving to Raleigh. It was that great. And it was predictable because now the public knows the rules and they stay out. Until we introduced a missing middle text change, and then all hell broke loose. But before that, people said, I know the rules. And they also know if they don't like how the rule turned out, they can come back and have it changed. To me, that's the implementation. 3 ways you implement a plan: policies and actions, capital investment, and the zoning code. Right now, you're at the stage of fulfilling that blueprint for growth by having that zoning code. Right rules, right places.
So I'll tell you, one of the issues you guys are going to spend some time talking about is, where do I put my car? It is a huge issue because great old urban places didn't have that problem. We didn't have 4 and 5 cars in a household. We didn't have that issue. Now, personally, I would rather not live in a world where everything I see as I walk down the street is a driveway that I have to cross. And as I've always said in our slideshows, little Susie can't ride her bike on that block, right? Because she's going to get run over by somebody pulling out of the garage. Where you put cars on commercial sites, where you put cars on residential sites is a big deal. Is the apartment building up at the street and the parking behind? Is the Office Depot up at the street and the parking behind, or at least to the side? Some of those kinds of concerns really affect the outcome. The walkability of the neighborhood is detracted from if all you're walking past is parking lots. It's much more interesting to walk past buildings, people, lively things, etc. And yet, we've gotten so used to, I'm in my office, I'm in my car, I'm in my home, maybe I'm in my church on Sunday, but fundamentally, everything in between is me driving around in my car. And therefore, the car becomes this key element of my lifestyle that I now need to accommodate. The more we think about trying to make housing more attainable, the less we can afford to spend on parking cars, the less we can afford to spend on land area they take up, the less we can afford to spend on garaging them all. Maybe some of them have to sit in the driveway. The more we look to some of those patterns that once existed in the older neighborhoods, which means the cars go somewhere other than always in your face in the front of the building.
Yeah. Peter, you're reaching, and so I'm going to give you a slightly different question to start rounding us out. Feel free to add on to that. Okay. But Lee mentioned like these old urban cities, right? They were built when cars weren't around. And Miriam kicked us off with saying, you know, we are kind of going through a once-in-a-generation process. How do we ensure that updating our zoning code isn't a once-in-a-generation endeavor, that we are creating a process that allows us to evolve with the growing and changing community?
Just to play off the parking and a little bit of what Mitchell described. I mean, the greatest cities in the world, just think of some great, amazing place that you've been, right? If there were cars, right? Was it easy to park in this really great place that you've been, this great city that you've been, this great urban place that you've been? No. And there's no parking requirement, even though it sounds like it's a parking ratio or something, and it sounds scientific because there's a minimal amount of math involved. There's no parking standard that is correct. There's no reason to fight over parking. And most cities, many cities, are just getting rid of their minimum parking requirement. Austin, Texas, got rid of their parking requirements, right? People in Austin drive big trucks. But the thing is that, right, the market's going to determine what kind of parking they're going to need. The finance and the banks are going to determine what kind of parking they feel comfortable needing. If anything, they might propose more parking than you want. But I think like the ideal parking standard is just below
what the market is actually going to do. Because there's no reason why government should require development to provide things that it doesn't need. A structured parking space, I don't know, in St. Louis, what's a structured parking space? One space in structure.
40 to 60. I don't know about here.
Okay, so that affects lots of cars, by the way. Because this parking is not free, and if I have to build it, I've got to pass that cost on to somebody. So why is government requiring me to build more parking? So I think that zoning is, as you go through this, well, we're talking about zoning tonight, and there's a lot of the conversations about zoning. Zoning is, it's just one tool in your toolbox for implementing your vision. It is not the singular tool. In many instances, it is not the most significant or even relevant for you to implement your plan.
I have a little bit different way of thinking about it. I mean, I think about it in four kind of categories. The regulatory tools like zoning or historic preservation codes or bill, right? Those help implement your aspirations and your plans. The second is investment in infrastructure, right? How do you invest? And third are partnerships. That government doesn't do everything. The municipal government of St. Louis does not build the city. The private sector builds the city. So sometimes you need to partner with other entities, other jurisdictions. And the fourth way that I think of implementing plans, and a lot of elected leaders hate this,
Because sometimes you got to do another plan, right? I mean, you do a citywide one and then you do a neighborhood one.
and sometimes there are certain areas where we didn't really update areas like Cherry Creek that were in the middle of a plan. We updated the zoning in that area as we finished that plan.
So the sequencing of implementation of the new zoning has to be understood as, the one thing is that it's not one thing. And there are these other tools that you need to look through to implement this great efficiency. I would say the last thing,
Finish up, Peter.
I wanted to talk a little bit about how can the code itself learn, which is, I think, where you were going. And many older codes are really a narrative. They're all text, and there are some dimensional requirements, for example, that are embedded in the text. And so in one section, there's something about the setback requirements. And in another section, and you'll see 25 feet is the setback. And it's in the middle of a paragraph someplace. And then there's another section that is talking about the minimum width of the driveway. And there's another dimension embedded into that paragraph. And so if you change one thing, sometimes it's that thread that you're pulling on. It's affecting something else in another section, but you don't catch that, and it doesn't get changed. And so you've got inconsistencies, and you're back with variances. The new codes use graphics and tables to set forth some of the restrictions. And so, for example, there will be a drawing of a house and say there is a maximum height limit. And imagine there's a line drawn and there's a number there that says the maximum height is 50 feet. Well, that's clearer than the narrative, but the number is embedded in the graphic. A more advanced code will have the letter A to symbolize that dimension of that height. And there's a table below that says A equals 50 feet. So if we learn later on that it ought to be 60 feet, it's a quick change. It's a text change and easy to edit. So part of it is the physical structure of the way the code is set up, in anticipation of the fact that it will learn.
So I think you've laid out a nice, simple framework. But what are the set of mechanisms that we put in place that allow the discussion to come forward where we can discover that A doesn't equal 50 anymore, it equals 70, right? How do we, essentially, zoning is about what are the preferences of the people who are holding a place together. And so how do we build in a continuous process of iterating the code to meet the preferences of the people of today and to the future?
So it's planning code, planning code, planning code. You're never done. Sorry about that. Because the world changes, technology changes, right? And so, think of it this way. I think of, how many of you started using computers and you used MS-DOS? Raise your hand. And how many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? Okay. So, yeah, exactly.
It's still there.
Yeah. But how many of you know Windows, for example, or use a Mac? Okay. So those are operating systems for computers. And MS-DOS was not quite as fast as moving through Windows, for those of you who have had the experience of both, right? And so think of your zoning code upgrade, this update, as you're changing your operating system. And we're moving from MS-DOS to something that is more graphic, something that is more easy to use and navigate. But the thing about it is, how many versions of Windows have there been? Or if you're using an Apple, how many versions of iOS have there been, right? The thing is, this is the opportunity to change your operating system, but you do have to update it. And that update needs to be
Together with the policy and the plan and the community conversations that you've had.
the way we set up the zoning code with Lee in Denver and the update of the zoning code was to implement Blueprint Denver, our land use and transportation plan, adopted in 2002. That was the foundation for the creation of the new code. That plan was updated in 2019. That plan uses the structure in the zoning code of context and form in the language of the plan. So there is an even strengthened tie between how the plan and how the code operate in terms of how they talk to each other. But that process of being nimble, of being flexible, of being able to update the code is, to me, it's more how do we construct the code now in this update, but also how you continue to engage in planning and community conversations as economies change, as technologies change, as people change, and our preferences change.
I'm going to very quickly answer the question. After we adopted our code as plan director, I kind of had an open door policy because we knew tweaks would be necessary. We held quarterly meetings with the development community that use the code on a regular basis to bring me things that aren't working. I asked my staff, as they're reviewing plans, if there are some blind spots or things that don't make sense to my attention. If the public aren't seeing what they expected, to bring that to my attention. And then I would provide a report to the council on an annual basis to make suggestions about the text changes that are needed, and then that would go through a public process. So it was a dynamic document because places change. I know that I love Peter with the MS-DOS, yes, I remember. But just to let you know, anybody know a daycare center? You know what daycare center is, right? Yeah, it didn't exist when I was a planner and started coming out. Did not exist. We had to figure out how to put it in the code. What about a health fitness facility where you go to a gym? Yeah, those didn't exist either.
How about Cat Cafe?
Cat Cafe, yeah, that didn't exist. All of us, the cloud, these data centers, which are just harming the landscape, those didn't exist. You've got to stay current with changes or turbines and windmills. I can go on and on and on. These things did not exist in the 1950s. They didn't. And so your code, I'm sure staff is trying to figure out what use group does it belong in, what category. You know, you just want to update. You okay, Peter?
Okay, but thought I probably having some horror stories that I've gone through this. All these uses were emerging, and data centers are the ones that are very disturbing. They're building them in residential areas. People are upset. It's bottom grade. They can't sell their homes. They can't get restitution. But we have to be ahead and anticipate these changes in development patterns of land uses. A loft, that did not exist. We're seeing shopping centers that are aging out, and now they're being repositioned by putting vertical residential. And people are like, oh, the traffic. No, people are now walking across the street. They're not driving. And so these are techniques that you want to take advantage of that makes your land uses more valuable. So my point is, it needs to be an annual review, an open door policy. We knew we'd have to make tweaks once it was adopted, and that's okay. We told the council, we told the public to prepare for it. So for the next 2 years, we made changes and they're.
Thank you. Lee, very quickly, as our local consultant here, so the timing of the dance between planning and code, a year? Seldom. What's your prescription?
18 months is good. That's high speed. 2 years is pretty solid, and we don't mind committing to 2 years most times. We do have examples. Yeah, he was great. But we do have the example of the city of Los Angeles. Now, the city of Los Angeles has 36 community plan areas, each of which would be a city in its own right in most places. That's how big the city is. So they're adopting in bits and pieces, and we're on our 14th year of working with them. I think it took us about 9 years before the first components were actually adopted. Part of that is because their lawyers take a year to 2 years to look at everything. So the council approves it Then it goes to the lawyers for a year, and then it comes back and it goes into place. So in many places, it's really difficult to do this. So 18 months is a great target, should start there. But it takes a meaningful public conversation, and that sometimes takes a little bit longer.
Thank you all for being part of this meaningful public conversation. And can we get an applause for the panelists for just sharing their expertise? Okay. I believe people have already submitted questions, right? So we've already rounded up all of them? Great, all right.
Okay, thank you so much for all the great questions. You're sort of categorizing them, but I have a few to start as we finish that. How do we make the right choices versus the desperate choices? For example, let's allow suburban style development in the city because we are just so happy someone wants to build something.
You know, it's an interesting question because I remember when I was planning director and I was talking to the mayor and we were getting these projects, and to the mayor's credit, he says, sometimes we just need to say no. We're demanding quality and we don't want to settle for mediocre because it'll be a race to the bottom. We're trying to build a 21st century city and our decisions matter. And there are times when we said no. It wasn't about quantity. For us, it was about quality. And we wanted to send a message that we didn't look, we want to know if the person investing looked at our city as a commodity because we wanted to build a community. And so from our perspective, we chose to say no strategically to send a message that we're not going to go out there to say we're making this deal out of desperation.
That was our perspective, but in other places that was so starving for development that they said yes. And then years later, you know, I teach a class and we kind of unpack something as a crime scene when it's a bad project, try to unpack exactly how this crime happened, how this happened. And some years later, it's like, how did they let this bad project happen? So it's okay to say no.
Every national retailer has prototypes. They have suburban prototypes and they have urban prototypes. They won't tell you they have urban prototypes, but they do. When you have a code that isn't clear and that it's a negotiation,
Since we're talking here, and you really want to insist on having it in the neighborhood.
how about we just give you the conventional prototype that's the easiest for us to build? Yeah, it doesn't look like it fits your neighborhood, but we can get it done. And so that's the thing about having a code that is upfront and clear and calibrated to the kind of places and the kind of neighborhoods that you want to strengthen, that you want to maintain, right? But you don't have it right now, right? And so that's the way to get there.
Can I do my favorite line?
Please.
All right, I just have to share, this is one of my favorite lines. People seem to really gravitate to it. But I'll tell people there were two types of cities. There were plan-making cities and there were deal-making cities. A lot of people don't like to work in deal-making cities because it's unpredictable. I loved working in Raleigh. It was a plan-making city. We planned it, we zoned it, we built it. Deal-making city, I have no idea. And I don't know, that's the answer you have to ask yourself. Well, St. Louis, are you a plan-making city or a deal-making city? All right, they said it, I didn't.
Thank you so much. Another thing, St. Louis, we have a lot of vacant land, but one thing we are very good at is like repurposing that for agricultural purposes. So what can zoning do for green space and urban agriculture? And how do both larger scale and smaller scale agriculture fit into that advice?
All day long. We've worked in Detroit, which has even more empty land area than you do. And there's some fascinating things there, like a pollinator corridor and some other kinds of things that were done just by regular people because they could. There's a guy who bought up blocks and blocks northwest of the downtown, and he's growing the forest. He's going to harvest in about 20 years because he thinks it'll be that long before the market is ready to use this land. So he's growing pine trees right now. Those things have to be enabled. They can, if inappropriately handled, become nuisances. So you have to put some, what do you call them, some barriers sort of around these kinds of things and be sure that the right rules are in place. You know, how many chickens can I have in my backyard? Some of those questions have to be answered. It's the same as managing pests or anything else. We have to have rules around those things. Now, some of those rules are outside zoning, but because the sort of land-intensive uses are likely to come here, I would suggest that zoning needs to get in that game a little bit and make sure that the right things are being done. One of the things that often gets controlled is the size of machinery that you can use. Because if you can't use a certain size machinery, you're not going to have a production farm. You're going to have a, Saturday farmers market farm instead, and that's probably just fine. Do you want milk cows in town? I'm not sure you did. Maybe you do. So a conversation to be held. Usually smaller animals are considered more reasonable to have in the community. But we have looked at those issues, and it does take a conversation to figure out how to accommodate them. But they are, in our minds, they're often an interim use. They're an interim use and stay a long, long time when you have a lot of land. So I think we should think pretty hard about what we do along that front.
There are many codes out there. In Raleigh, we did for urban farm and urban garden. And then we listed where they were permitted. And so that's something you could look at many codes to show, but it does fit in, has an interim use. Parking lots, in some cases gardens, are interim uses until something else comes along. By the way, I know you said you're a deal-making city, but the fact that you did your strategic land use plan, that you're doing this, St. Louis, you're on the right track. Coming up, Iron City.
Next question. I think this is a combination of many questions. St. Louis has many historic districts, code overlays, and areas of form-based code. Speak to how these interact now and how they could or should in the future to simplify.
You handed it to me.
I think you are the historic preservationist, Nori.
Thanks a lot. Certainly historic preservation is very important to St. Louis. I mean, my comment. You've referenced it. Wonderful, wonderful places to live in, but also to visit. So I'm sure you all have talked about the potential for heritage tourism and how that can support economic development and things like that. There are places that we do want to preserve, but that doesn't mean freezing them in aspic. How can we have historic districts that remain viable and vital and can accommodate change? If we're focusing on character, the number of people living there maybe isn't so much of an issue. And the fact that we might be able to add an ADU in that historic district maybe isn't so much of an issue either. That said, a lot of design review systems try to handle zoning code issues either because the code is deficient or it's wrong. And so you will have people fighting in a design review environment over something that the code should have already answered. So a key part of this is to be certain, and this has been a theme here, is where there are places that you value now, whether they're an official historic district or an established neighborhood with character that you love, let's get the code to support that so that you're not fighting that battle in the design review process. And the design review process focuses on what it should be doing. In an historic district, I mean, the code focuses on form, maybe materials, placement of where the car goes, et cetera. But in historic preservation, we're also concerned about preserving the details of that building. The code can't do that. That has to happen in some other kind of discretionary process. But the same lessons learned about how to structure a zoning code can apply to how you structure the design guidelines. So they also are clearer and simpler and easier to administer. Same goals, same approach, but understanding that they are going to be dealing with some things that are a bit more discretionary.
So there are two things when we talk about preservation, historic preservation and zoning. I mean, I think about historic preservation, historic, capital H and little h. And one of the things that does happen, I don't know if that happens here, but the community might want to try to get an area designated because they don't like the outpost. So because the zoning's allowing things that they don't want. Yeah, they're kind of preservationists, but they're seeing it more as a protection, right? So if the code, the zoning could do that work,
It doesn't necessarily have to become a local district, right? I'm not against local district. I'm just saying, right? It runs to bring more clarity that if the code does a better job, maybe some of those concerns can be alleviated. The other side of it is when we write the code, that we write it in a way that gives within the zoning where you do have those capital H locally designated areas, and even National Register, more flexibility in the zoning. So there are more administrative adjustments that are administratively handled, because if they're 120-year-old buildings, yeah, no kidding, they're probably not going to have, they're not going to be conforming in some way. So just to bake into the code itself greater flexibility for those areas that are designated historic.
One more tool, which is baby historic, conservation districts, they're often called. Neighborhood conservation is more about character preservation, keeping mass and scale similar to what might be there. Great example from Raleigh would be mill houses, which were little 4 squares usually, just little story and a half houses. But the zoning that we've had since the beginning of time said single-family neighborhoods are 35 feet tall, and that's too tall for that mill house look. So if you really want the mill house look, what do? Well, you could add more volume behind the house. You could add more volume elsewhere on the property, but what you face from the street should conserve that original character of a mill house. There are probably lots of areas where you don't need the full historic toolkit. You could go with the easier conservation toolkit and get perhaps an imperfect version, but one that not only protected the existing housing stock, but allowed for growth in the neighborhoods and change in the neighborhoods in a way that kept some of that character as you walked past that or drove past that. So conservation districts is another tweener tool right there.
Thank you so much. So we are running up on time because we have to be out of here by 8. So I have one last question, like lightning round. Actually, sort of looking at you, Dara, because I think you can hold us accountable for this. But as we move through this process, how do we ensure people with the most power and money don't set all the rules?
It is really simple. Show up. It is embarrassing to listen to those people in the hearings. They are so self-serving. They are so non-city centric. They are people that don't have the same interests that you have. And yes, some of them may sit on your boards and commissions and councils and whatever, but they are not typically the dominant folks there. This city can grow in a way that you can all deal with and feel comfortable with. There are some areas of this city where maybe it's okay to blow things out and let some crazy out-of-town guy through some kind of crazy development. And there are areas of this city that they should never be allowed to work in, just because they don't have the sensibilities for those areas. That happens at the political level. You heard it earlier at the start of the conversation. So the simple answer is, as this is moving towards adoption, try to go to these kinds of sessions where you can hear about what the new rules might be, and then show up when the city council is looking at those things and listening to people. Show up and say, we've been sitting here all along. I sat here at the opening of this process, and I've been following it all along. And I'm not hearing what the community was saying to you out of these gentlemen or these women who are showing up in front. This is a public process, and you gotta vote the bums out.
Okay, Lee, that was good. He's always direct. I love Lee. I don't want to blow up the public process, but one of the things I've learned, and this is Candance, I shared it with her, I always look at the demographics of a city. And to me, you have to be intentional, not just having town halls where you come to us. The team has to go to communities and have intentional conversations, which may be different. The topics may be different. I already outed the place I didn't want to talk about, but there was, at that place, the Black community was talking about gentrification and this and that. We went to the neighborhoods, 2 people showed up. How am I supposed to react to that? And showing up is important. As was stated, this hasn't been done in 70 years. You're doing something for not just present generations, but future ones. That is an investment of time that is worth it. So whether you have ambassadors that get the word out, going out, not just coming here, but going out into neighborhoods, because each issue is going to be different. Communities of color have a different experience with zoning, a lot of barriers, a lot of rules, how many unrelated individuals live in a house, the definition of family, about home occupation businesses. The issues are different, and you're not going to get that in large groups. So I do agree with Lee that you have to show up and recognize, and then speak in plain English when you talk about zoning. We're using terms that we didn't even get into. You have to talk in plain English so that everyone understands, and use graphics and pictures so that we're all on the same level. And then we can talk about the issues that are important to you. I love in the back what zoning can do and can't do. We also have to have that conversation about how zoning can help and how zoning can't do that. Because sometimes we look for a tool that can solve everything. So I think that's one of the things that you can do, but you have to spread the word. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're moving toward a plan-making city. The city's behind it. They already passed a future land use map. Now it's time to take the next step. But the city has to go out, have those conversations, if the budget allows, to make sure they hear all voices. And if I go into a room and see a certain demographic over 55 and not under 55, time out. If I see one that's dominated from one race and not the other, time out. You have to hear all voices, and you just don't plan for those who show up. You have to really, to town halls, you have to go out and do the hard work in the community, in the neighborhood.
I agree with Mitch, right? We have to show up outside of just, the nice park. I could have predicted what this room was going to look like. And yes, I'm making some assumptions, but I think I'm largely right with what I predicted here. So yes, we have to show up in other places. We also have to be really mindful about showing up where everyday life happens. People cannot come to meetings. So that means we have to bring the zoning discussion to the pickup line at the schools, right? We have to show up in the barbershop. We have to be in the bank line. We have to make this just part of our everyday conversation and considerations. So yes, it's important that we show up to the meeting, but also planning team, you got to show up where people are just living life every day and having that conversation. The other part of it is, at the end of the day, somebody has to approve it. Look at your planning commission. Who's on that commission? Get to know them, get in their ear, make sure that you and your neighbors, what you need, what you want for not just now, because when we make decisions about what's just now, that's desperation. Let's think about what's needed in the next 10 years, right? And make sure that your commissioners understand what is needed for you and your community in the next 10 years.
And please read the plan, or the short version of the plan, before you come to those conversations. Right? Because this is not a relitigation of the plan. Even though some folks, I think it, like, I don't know about that plan. But you know what? You get that? But all the work and all the energy, right? This piece of work has to build on the momentum, on the trust, and on the goodwill that was earned in the creation of this. So, right, just keep strengthening that. But it means that people need to, as much as possible, be able to quickly start from, well, what does the plan say?
Thank you all so much. We are running out of time. I have not introduced myself. My name is Jessica Payne. I'm with Key Strategic Group. We're the local engagement firm. So we heard everything you were saying. We are taking that to heart and putting that into the rest of our engagement plan. This is not the last conversation. We're going to have a number of public conversations, panels, ways for you to engage throughout this process. So stay tuned for that. If you have signed up, we have your email. We will be in touch with you. All of the questions you gave us, that is more content for our next Zoop, for our website, for our social media. So we are taking those questions. We are going to answer them in some form or fashion so they did not get lost. They will be incorporated into this work. We thank you for your time. Please visit the boards in the back. Leave your comments. Let us know if you actually want cows and other things like that came up today. Like, we want to know. Those are the things we want to know. And then I'm going to hand it off to Miriam for a last few words.
Yeah, we received a couple of questions that I thought might be, or we thought might be best for staff to answer. So a lot of questions about the advisory committee. Applications still open. You're going to, on the website, you're going to find a lot of information about that. And the selection, this is very intentional. We're doing it not picking and choosing based on who we know and whatever. It's going to be sort of a structured lottery to make sure we get a range of perspectives. It is not going to cover every perspective, and so we're going to have lots more community engagement, and I think everything Dara told us to do, the panel told us to do, we need to do, hold us accountable. But hopefully that provides some context about the advisory committee. Another really important question is, how will this process incorporate the planning, the neighborhood planning in areas 1 through 3, and then also the neighborhood planning that's about to begin in other North City communities. In addition to the strategic land use plan, the neighborhood plans are a kind of core basis for this work. So we are going to work really closely with those neighborhood planning teams to make sure that number one, that is a great place for us to go to people in community that are already convening to think about the future of their neighborhood in a deliberate process. So we're going to be working through those teams to make sure that we're really absorbing all of the land use goals into this code, into the map. I think that is a really, really important thing. Like Jess said, thank you so much for all these great questions. I found myself like applauding for some of the questions, strangely. And we will be answering them more in a synthesized way online. So if your question didn't get asked and answered tonight, know that we receive it, we value it, and we'll be following up with information about it. And please do interact with the boards and things in the back part of the room. Also, kind of come talk to us. Can everybody on the either city team or kind of planning zoning team raise their hand? So if you have a question, go find these nice people. And can commissioners raise their hand? We have some VIP planning commissioners in the audience. Sorry, here you are. They're going to be really, really important here as well. And then I do really want to thank and recognize the elected officials here with us tonight, some of whom are also members of the Planning Commission. Alderwoman Shamim Clark-Hubbard, Alderman Michael Browning, Alderwoman Saunier. If I have overlooked anybody, please slap me. But really, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support in getting this process moving. Also, just thank you all for being here with us tonight. Thank you to the panelists for kind of sharing your insight. It's possible some of what you heard tonight was a little intimidating, maybe some of it inspiring, but really do stick with us through this process because we can't do it right unless you're part of it. So we're going to keep showing up, coming to you, and just thank you, and look forward to connecting and chatting the rest of the evening.